Good morning. Happy Sabbath. I'd like to go back, if I could please, to our scripture reading this morning in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 through 22. Paul writing, "Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, that are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all of the building, fitly framed together, groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit." On December 2nd, the year 1942, an event occurred that was going to change the world forever. Working in a racquetball court beneath the University of Chicago's Stagg Field grandstand, Enrico Fermi, an Italian scientist who had fled fascism in Italy, supervised the design and the assembly of the world's first atomic pile, or nuclear reactor. Professor Fermi himself referred to his creation as, the way he put it, a crude pile of black bricks and wooden timbers. Fermi's pile of bricks was made out of uranium and graphite and cadmium, and was the world's first source of a sustained, controlled nuclear reaction. Neutrons from decaying uranium would fly out and crash into the nuclei of other uranium atoms and so on, causing them to release more neutrons, which would split other atoms, and on and on. What made the pile work was the proximity, the closeness of these radioactive bricks to each other. Each brick had the potential of nuclear energy, but by itself it couldn't produce enough energy to do any useful work. Piled closely together, they provided the needed energy to cause the other nearby bricks to join in the reaction. This discovery went on to lay the foundation for many positive applications of nuclear science, as well as, as we know today, the use of nuclear power in weapons. There were some positive things that came out of it, as well as the use in weapons. But Fermi's experiment would have failed if it had not brought all of the elements necessary together when and where he did. Each brick contained uranium atoms, and each brick by itself had radioactive properties, and each brick produced a small amount of random energy. And while this is interesting, and probably by themselves each one could have been studied, the individual bricks weren't very efficient at getting anything done. There wasn't really enough useful energy being produced by each brick by itself. The reactions that happened in each brick happened in a random fashion and at such a low level that they really couldn't do any work. It wasn't until those bricks were actually organized into a pile that they were effective. When they were brought together, they were able to produce some sustained and useful energy. Going back to our scripture reading again, Paul writes, "Now therefore, you are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building, fitly framed together, groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for a habitation of God through the Spirit." The temple of God, his church, according to Paul, is built upon the foundation of Jesus Christ. He is the chief cornerstone. Now, I'd like to tell you about this idea about a chief cornerstone and all that. These are architectural terms. When you talk about a chief cornerstone, understand that a lot of the structures around 60 AD were built out of stone. And one of the things that they learned early on as they were trying to build things out of stone is that you had to have a single point of reference from which you could take all your measurements to make sure all of the walls were square and the walls were plumb, straight up and down. If you took your measurements off of a single place, you knew, just using math, you knew that you could make all the other corners right. You could make the walls nice and straight, you could make them plumb, and you could make them square, and the building would stand. It would make a firm building. The cornerstones were, of course, as you could understand, they were on the corners of the building. But there was always one stone that was laid. Usually it was laid first. And that was called the chief cornerstone. And that was the stone from which they took all of the measurements to make sure that everything was uniform and built in a fashion that it would stand. Now this term is used here. Paul is using the idea of Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. He is the one from which all other measurements are to be taken. It becomes what you might call a point of orientation. You orient everything according to that stone. Peter, writing in his first epistle in chapter 2, verse 5 says, "Ye also, as lively," or today we might translate that word living, "ye also as living stones are built up a spiritual house." If you belong to Jesus Christ, if you are his, if he's your personal chief cornerstone, your point of orientation, then you're each living stones framed together and built together into a holy temple, a habitation for God. If you belong to Jesus, if he's your cornerstone, then you're built together with the other living stones, as Peter referred to them, into a temple, a habitation for God, which is his church. Each part of the sanctuary, as it was originally designed, the one that God commanded to be built, each part in itself was beautiful, and it had a divinely ordained function in revealing the plan of God for the salvation of the world. The veils and the altars, the vestments of the priests and the ministers, the sacrifices and the offerings and the feasts, even the position that the sanctuary occupied at the center of the encampment. All of the parts and all of the services of that holy sanctuary, his great object lesson, remember that his sanctuary was not just an end unto itself. It was an object lesson, something God was using in order to teach his people the gospel. Indeed, if we were to take a look at the books Exodus through Deuteronomy, we might justly retitle those books The Gospel According to Moses, because the gospel is what was taught in those sanctuary services and in the things that Moses wrote down, the instructions that God gave him. It was the gospel, absolutely and surely. So God had a sanctuary that he had his people build on the earth. And it was his great object lesson. And it was there to preach the everlasting gospel to his people, to the world. The Lord set these things in order so that the world might be able to know him and be saved through him. Remember that the services, again, they were not an end unto themselves. These things all were designed so that when Jesus would come, they would be able to recognize him. They would understand what his mission was, the work that he was to do. Everybody who is here, everyone who's listening, if you belong to Jesus Christ, and I hope you do, and if you don't yet belong to Jesus Christ, or if you're not sure that you still belong to Jesus Christ, then you need to not let the sun go down today before you have made your calling and your election sure. Make sure that you belong to Jesus today.